Greetings everyone, this is David Arhan, and today's video is going to be about icon veneration and how it is clearly biblical. Most of you are already aware of the longer video I have done on icon veneration being clearly Christian, though in that video I have focused a little bit on the biblical aspect of icon veneration. In this video I want to give a total complete attention to the biblical aspect of icon veneration. I've seen some arguments here and there, some blog posts and so forth, but I think the arguments aren't as strong as they could be. So in this video, I'm going to be focusing mainly on St. John Damascus's argument on icon veneration from his 3 treatises on the defense of the holy images. And that's what I will be doing in this video. So who believes in icon veneration? More correctly, who believes icon veneration is apostolic and biblical? Now, there's various different Protestant confessions that are iconophobic. They're either outright iconoclastic or they don't believe they should be venerated. And Roman Catholics. Some Roman Catholics might object to this. Now, I think everyone knows that Roman Catholics do have images in their churches and they venerate those images. What they do agree with Protestants is that, and if you look at various different Roman Catholic apologists today, popular Roman Catholic apologists, they admit this. They argue that icon veneration is a development of doctrine. In fact, John Henry Newman himself used the Seventh Ecumenical Council as an example of doctrine of development, right? And the basic premise here is that icon veneration is not biblical. It's not part of the apostolic deposit of faith. It's something that developed over time, right? This is something that Roman Catholics and Protestants agree with. The only ones that believe that icon veneration is apostolic and that we should do this are, well, primarily the Orthodox Christians, because we believe in the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And even though they don't believe in the Seventh Ecumenical Council and the underlying theology behind it, Orientals and the Church of the East do have icons and they do have icon veneration, right? But it's really the Orthodox Christians that accept the Seventh Ecumenical Council and accept the idea that icon veneration is apostolic, because the Seventh Ecumenical Council itself states that anyone who argues that icon veneration is not apostolic, it's not biblical, is to be condemned, right? So what is the argument? I'm going to give the summary of the argument, the basic summary of what I'm going to be arguing in this video. An icon is a representation. Of course, it's more than a representation, but for the sake of this video, we're going to be sticking to the basic definitions. An icon is a representation. The Bible commands us to venerate representations and icons of God. Therefore, the Bible commands us to venerate icons. An alternative way to look at this is that any argument one can biblically use to oppose the veneration of icons will be contradicting the Bible, right? And what I'm going to be doing in this video is I'm going to establish from the Bible itself how that is the case. First thing I want to look at is the difference between worship and veneration. Worship, which in Greek you can think of it as the term latria, and in the Latin it is the term adoratio, is the internal state and act of adoration or service, what man recognizes as God, right? So it is something that is given to God alone. Veneration, on the other hand, is the giving of respect to something. This respect can be given to God and also to the saints and to angels and to images. Now, the idea of veneration is that veneration is given to something because that person commands respect or some relation that person has to God, right? Some representation that person has to God. What ultimately distinguishes the two is the internal state and inclination of man, right? So an example of this will be that someone can be treating their favorite sports team as an idol by looking at it as the meaning of their life and the source of their happiness and all of this thing, which is something that only God should occupy. They might be giving that kind of attention to something worldly, right? This could be money, this could be a sports team, this could be a celebrity or whatever, without doing any kind of, bodily movements to showcase that kind of veneration, right? And so I think this is a good enough demonstration that there's a distinction between or outwardly bodily movement and or internal state of giving adoration to something. Now, when it comes to the term worship in the Bible, this is where things get a little bit confusing. So I want people to pay special attention to this part. The way we use the term worship today is very much synonymous, very much same with the term latria, or adoratio in Latin, which is, as I've stated, something that is given to God alone. But in the King James Version, in the English translation, this is not the case. The term worship is a lot more broad than that. It can mean that. It can mean adoration. It does include that, depending on the context. But what it really means is bowing down or doing obeisance, right? Well, and doing obeisance more so. So it's the term worship doesn't just include, in the King James Version, doesn't just include the idea of adoring something. It can also, again, contextually include the idea of just giving respect, that is, venerating that something. This is going to be a very key point. And another point that I want to make is that latria, so from now on I'm going to be using the Greek term because I think is simpler in explaining this. Latria necessarily includes proskinesis, meaning adoration, giving, doing service, necessarily includes venerating that something. So when you adore God, you necessarily venerate God. But it doesn't mean that proskinesis necessarily includes latria. So just because you venerate something doesn't mean that you adore that thing, right? From a biblical standpoint, this can actually be proven that there is such a distinction. If you look at Matthew 4:10 and Luke 4:8, Christ says, "Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve." Now again, when we read the term worship, you understand that, it's talking about adoring, but that's not what was actually being stated, right? Thou shalt proskinesis, right? That is bow down to or do obeisance to God, but to God alone you shall give service. That is latria. Now again, latria is something given to the Holy Trinity alone. And Christ himself states that. But Christ says, well, you bow down to God. He doesn't say you bow down only to God. He says you bow down to God. And this is a very nuanced but a very key distinction. We can bow down to God, we can bow down to other things as well. But we must understand that we serve God alone, right? And a key aspect of this argument, and I will go into this in the later slides, is there are various different Bible verses that showcase that holy men, holy angels, and even various different objects have been bowed down to, right? So that's going to be a key aspect of the argument. But before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about the basic iconoclast objection, which is the second commandment, right? Most people think that the second commandment is saying that we cannot make any images and give respect to them. That is not what the second commandment is saying, because if that was what the second commandment was saying, then the Bible won't say 5 chapters later that you should make 2 cherubims of gold, of beaten work shalt thou make them in the 2 ends of the mercy seat, right? Now we must understand that the cherubim and the seraphim are the highest spiritual beings in the angelic hierarchy, right? The only being that is higher than them in the spiritual hierarchy is God himself, right? So this should give you an idea that pretty much any spiritual being, except for God himself, in his own essence, can have their images made of, right? But we can make images of Christ now. That is because Christ has become incarnate. He has become man for our salvation. And we make images of Christ to attest to the reality of his incarnation. If you're not allowed to make images of Christ, but if you're allowed to make images of men, then you're basically saying Christ is not a man, right? That's the basic idea behind this. And a graven image, which is something that we should not be making, is an image of a false deity. And so we shouldn't, bow down to a false deity, right? We shouldn't bow down to an image of Zeus and say, well, it's an image of Zeus, but I think it's Christ, right? We shouldn't bow down to an image of a pagan deity and say that it's the Virgin Mary, right? The second commandment bans us from doing that. It forbids us from doing that. And we should not be doing something like that. But it doesn't say that we cannot make images of spiritual beings, of God's friends, or even of the incarnate God himself. That is not what the second commandment is saying. So we must be mindful of that. Moreover, the idea of iconography is very much strongly within biblical theology. First of all, man is made in the image of God. So man is an icon of God. Christ is the natural image of the Father, as St. Paul says in his epistle to the Hebrews. He says Christ is the natural image of the person of the Father, right? He is the express image of the person of the Father. That is what he says, actually. And so Christ is the natural image of the Father. And so when we worship God in the Spirit, and we worship the Son, and the Son, this worship, this service, that is, this adoration passes to the Father indivisibly, because the Son is the express image of the Father, right? St. Basil the Great says, because the honor paid to the image passes on to the prototype. What does this mean? Well, again, Christ is the image, the Father is the prototype, and the honor given to Christ passes on to the prototype. The vice versa is also true. This is why, for example, Christ says that whoever does not have the Son does not have the Father. Whoever does not worship the Son does not have the Father. So any religion that denies the Son, well, denies the Father, denies God, right? So that's the basic logic behind it. And when it comes to worship, iconography is important as well, because Hebrews 8, right? St. Paul says in Hebrews 8, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, says he, that thou make all things according to the pattern that is shown to thee in the mount. So what is the point of this verse? The point of this verse is the earthly liturgy and the earthly worship is a icon of the heavenly liturgy, right? And so we partake of the heavenly liturgy because of the image of the heavenly liturgy that is on the earth. This is why we are doing worship not just alone with ourselves, but we're also worshiping in communion with the angels and with the saints. That's a very basic principle. And St. Paul talks extensively about this, not just in Hebrews chapter 8, but he talks about it through chapter 8 to 10, right? And temples and churches are the works of human hands, and they glorify God. I'm going to be talking about them in the verses. So to summarize this slide, when one venerates an image, what is being venerated is not, the wood that it is made of or something like that, but rather of what the icon represents by its appearance. The veneration of icon passes over to what is being depicted, just like how worshiping the Son is worshiping the Father. And when it comes to Christian ethics, the idea of the image of God is very, very crucial. In fact, the whole parable of the sheep and the goats is very much based on this, right? Because all men are made in the image of God, and we can even say we are made in the image of Christ. And Christ says that if you do not feed the hungry, and if you do not give water to the thirsty, and if you do not take, be a good host to a stranger who's a guest in your house, and various different examples, then you're showing that disrespect you show to that person. That disrespect passes on to Christ himself, right? That's the point of Matthew 25:31 to 46. That's the whole point of the parable, is that because man is made in the image of God, we must treat man with respect, because if we treat man with disrespect, we treat God himself with disrespect. The whole basis, again, of Christian ethics is based on the idea that man is made in the image of God. For example, if someone murders a person, then that is counted as murdering God himself. This is why murder is evil. We should not do it, because you are murdering the image of God himself. You're doing disrespect towards God. And various different moral examples can be used, but that should give you an idea of how important iconography already is in the Bible itself. And when it comes to spiritual warfare, this plays a crucial role, because as St. Basil the Great says in his commentary on Isaiah, the devil who is warring against God knows that he cannot defeat God, because God is all powerful. And so in order to maintain his warfare against God, he attacks the image of God. And who is made in the image of God? Man himself, right? And so this is why there's such a thing as spiritual warfare. This is why the demons war over against us, right? This is why a lot of the evils of the world and all of this kind of stuff, that kind of explains it. That kind of gives you an idea that we are an icon of God, that we have the image of God in us, is precisely the reason why the demons are attacking us. Now, let's get into the idea of the footstool of God. This is going to be very crucial. In the Old Testament, the footstool of God is understood to be the dwelling place of God, right? That's very much what it meant. And there is an object that is called the footstool of God. This object is the Ark of the Covenant, right? The Ark of the Covenant was considered to be God's dwelling place. And for this reason, it was treated with respect. Now, the Ark of the Covenant prefigures various different things. It prefigures the incarnation, right? St. Paul says in Colossians 2:9, For in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, right? Just like how God dwelt within the ark, now he in the incarnation dwells within a body, right? Christ, the Son of God, dwells within his own human body now. St. John Damascus also says, "For this is his rest, and the earth is his footstool, for in it he dwelt in the flesh among men, and his sacred flesh has been named the foot of God," right? So this is referring to Isaiah 66:1, where, God says, "The earth is my footstool." And this is a prefigurement of the incarnation as well, because Baruch 3:36-38 in the Douay Rheims version points out how God really makes earth his footstool. It says, "This is our God, and there shall no other be accounted of in comparison of him. He found out all the way of knowledge and gave it to Jacob his servant and to Israel his beloved. Afterwards he was seen upon earth and conversed with men," right? So what we can get from the Ark of the Covenant is that it's a prefigurement of the incarnation. It's also a prefigurement of the Virgin Mary, because God dwelt within the Virgin Mary for 9 months, right? So that's one of the reasons. So how was the footstool of God, how was the Ark of the Covenant treated? Well, we see a very clear example of this in Joshua 7:6. Joshua rent his clothes and fell to the earth upon his face before the ark of the Lord until the eventide. He and the elders of Israel, and put dust upon their heads. So we see in Joshua 7:6, bowing down to the ark of the covenant. It's not just Joshua 7:6, it's also Psalm 99:5. "Exalt ye the Lord our God, and worship at his footstool, for he is holy." Now, if you look at the Greek translation, the statement "worship at his footstool," it's not supremely incorrect, but it might give a false impression. It might give the idea that people gathered around the Ark of the Covenant and they just did some prayers. No, what this verse is actually saying is that they bowed down to the footstool of God, right? So what is being, quote, worshipped, and remember, when we say worship, we're talking about bowing down or doing obeisance. What is being bowed down to here, what is being venerated, is the footstool, is the Ark of the Covenant, right? Same applies to Psalm 132:7, right? Pretty much. So more accurate translation will be, "Exalt ye the Lord or God, and worship his footstool, for it is holy." Or venerate his footstool, right? That will be the more accurate understanding for the purpose of this video. So we can see here, the Ark of the Covenant is a created object. It's a physical object, but it also in a sense represents God. That is, represents the dwelling of God, represents what's going to happen in the future. And for this reason, we are commanded, they were commanded to venerate it, just like how we are commanded to venerate the body of our Lord. And 1 Samuel 6:19-20 gives us an idea of this, right? For example, Dagon, the idol of Dagon, when it fell down, and it was as if Dagon was bowing down to the Ark of the Lord, right? Venerating the Ark of the Lord. Then we have 2 Samuel 6:7, which talks about Uzzah disrespecting the Ark of the Covenant, and this has caused him to die, right? This disrespect, this object is so holy that the disrespect given to this object is as if God himself was disrespected, right? And that's precisely the reason, why the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, because Uzzah disrespected God precisely for this. It wasn't because he made some error in some kind of, I gave you these rules and you didn't follow. No, it's not just because of that. It's because he treated God himself in a disrespectful manner. Now let's look at Bible verses that talk about various different men bowing down to other men. Genesis 23:7. "And Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, even to the children of Heth." Genesis 33:3. "And he," that is Jacob, "passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother Esau." And as far as I know, Hebrews 11:21 talks about this as well. Genesis 47:31 in the Septuagint says, "And he said, swear to me, and he swore to him. And Israel did reverence, leaning on the top of his staff," right? Then there's Acts 16. "And he called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas and brought them out and said, 'Men, what must I do to be saved?' And they said, 'Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household.'" Notice he isn't rebuked for bowing down to Paul and Silas, right? This was considered to be fine. And then there's 1 Chronicles 29:20. Then David said to the whole assembly, "Praise the Lord your God." So they all praised the Lord, the God of their fathers. They bowed down, prostrating themselves before the Lord and the king. So David himself was bowed down to. This was considered to be fine. Daniel 2:46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. We shall too bow down before Daniel and pay him honor, right? This is something that is completely fine. This is not, the Bible does not say that this is something you should do. Now, there are certain Bible verses that some people might use to argue against this. I'm going to be responding to that in the later part of this video. Now, examples of bowing down to the angels. There's Joshua 5:14. And he said, "Nay, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship, that is bowed down to, or did obeisance, and said unto him, "What says my Lord unto his servant?" Then there's Daniel 8:17, where Daniel is bowing down to an angel. There's Genesis 19, where Lot is bowing down to the two angels that came to Sodom. And the two angels, they're not part of the Holy Trinity, right? The Christ, right, the angel in the middle, that is, he remained with Abraham in Genesis 18. The two angels that came to Sodom were actual created angels, and they received obeisance. They received Lot, bowing down to them. Then there's Luke 24. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. The two men are angels, by the way. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" The angels didn't say, "Why are you bowing down to me?" They said, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" Right? Referring to the resurrection. Now, a very crucial point that I want to make, and very few people might consider this, but St. John Damascus actually caught this, and I think it's a fantastic argument that very, very few people use. We need to consider the nature of an angel, right? Angels are of a spiritual substance. That is, they cannot be seen with the naked eye, right? So what we see is the physical manifestation in the form of a human being, right? When angels, most of the time in the Bible, they manifest in the form of a human being, right? And this is, their job is to minister to us. And the easiest way that they can minister to us is, manifesting in a human form, right? But the human form is not, they're not human by nature. Angels are not human by nature. That human appearance is not part of their nature, right? It's part of their manifestation in space. So we have seen some examples, as you can see here, of men bowing down to angels, and this is considered to be okay. Now, when someone is bowing down to an angel, let's say, what is going on? Well, what is literally going on is that you're merely bowing down to an appearance of a man. Are you really bowing down to an angel? Not really, right? You're not really doing that in a literal sense. But the physical appearance is a representation of that angel. Now, when you're bowing down, when you're giving respect to that physical representation, you are really giving respect to what that physical representation represents, which is the angel himself in his nature. And so St. John Damascus makes the argument that, in fact, you see a very clear example of iconography here. I mean, we have in the Old Testament an example of bowing down to an icon of an angel. And the Bible is completely fine with this, right? God himself is completely fine with this happening. This is not seen as something that is worthy of a rebuke. So when the Bible speaks of angels being bowed down to, what is literally going on is that the physical appearance is being bowed down to. This is because the physical appearance is a representation, that is, in other words, an icon of them. The logical conclusion of this is that the idea of bowing down to an icon and the honor giving to it, passing on to what it represents, is clearly biblical. Now, temples are icons of God. Christ himself says in Matthew 23:21, "Whoso shall swear by the temple, swear by it and by him that dwells therein." Well, who dwells in the temple of God? Who dwells in the house of God? God himself. So if you swear by the temple of God, you're swearing by God himself, right? Which basically means temples are, in a sense, images of God. And in fact, temples are bowed down to as well, right? So we have Psalm 26:8, "Lord, I have loved the habitation of thy house and the place where thine honor dwells." And then we have 1 Kings 8:44, Psalm 5:7, and Psalm 138:2, all of these verses are talking about how the temples are being bowed down to, right? Temples are there, it is telling that we should be bowing down toward or to the temple. So it's not just holy men, it's not just holy angels, it's also even temples and churches themselves. We should bow down to them. This is why, for example, in the Orthodox tradition, when you, for example, exit the church, right as we exit, you're supposed to bow down to the church. This is why we have this. It's because this is it's actually a biblical tradition, right? You're supposed to bow down to the church because, again, it's God's house. It's the dwelling place of God. Now, before I get to the conclusion and summarize the argument, some people might use certain Bible verses like Revelation 19 or Revelation 22 or Acts 10, where there is bowing down occurring, and the angel, or Peter himself, in the case of Acts 10, is actually rebuking this happening. Isn't this supposed to refute what I'm saying? I think this is a wrong argument. First of all, if it means that we cannot bow down to beings other than God, if this is not that is not allowed, we should only bow down to God, right? We should only do obeisance to God. If that's what it means, then all of these verses that I just used, right, all these verses you see are clearly contradicting Acts and Revelation. Now, instead of looking at it from that perspective, let's go back to what I said earlier, right? The term worship is a lot more broad in the King James Version. It includes veneration. It can also, again, contextually include worship, right? Worship in the sense of adoration and giving service. So what we see in Revelation 19, Revelation 22, and Revelation 10, there wasn't just a bowing down, just mere reverence and veneration, but something more was going on, some kind of adoration, right? So, for example, in the case of Apostle John bowing down to an angel, this can be explained away by stating, well, John taught that the angel was Christ himself, right? Because he was aware of the theophanies in the Old Testament. Or Cornelius, right? Cornelius, who was, a Roman pagan, as far as I know, might have just taught, that Peter was a divine person by himself. This is why Peter corrects him and says, stand up, I too am a man, right? He says, I'm not some demigod, I'm not God, I'm not anything like that. I'm just a human being like you are, right? So this veneration wasn't just mere veneration, but it was also adoration. That is what is being corrected. So again, the term worshiping, the King James Version, is a very broad term. And we cannot think that it just specifically means one thing over the other, right? As I've said before in this video, adoring God necessarily includes doing obeisance and bowing down to God. It necessarily includes that as veneration. But the vice versa doesn't follow, right? Veneration doesn't necessarily include adoration because they're distinct and there's distinct aspects to that. And so this is how we will explain the verses that seemingly refute the idea that you can bow down to created beings. They actually don't refute that idea. And so when we have covered all of these things, we can conclude that there's a distinction between venerating something, and that is worship in the King James sense, and adoring it, that is worship in the contemporary sense, the way we use it today, generally speaking. Icons, as I've said, are representations, particularly of God, and are venerated throughout the scripture. The difference is in the mode of that veneration between what is in scripture and what is in today, right? In the Old Testament, there was a veneration of the ark, veneration of holy men, veneration of holy angels, veneration of the temple. In the New Testament, due to the incarnation, we have the veneration of physical images that represent holy men, holy angels, and most importantly, the Son of God himself. Now, as I've stated the summary of the argument at first, we can conclude that any biblical attempt at rejecting icon veneration will contradict the Bible itself. You cannot reject the distinction between veneration and adoration. You will be contradicting Christ himself. You cannot deny the fact that created objects were given glory and even bowed down to, the Ark of the Covenant. You cannot deny that the physical appearances of angels were venerated. And you also likewise cannot deny the fact that that veneration passed on to the angels themselves. You cannot deny that since Christ became man, images of him can be made. Either affirm that images of Christ can be made, and if there's an image of Christ, well, it's an image of Christ. We should venerate venerated, right? We should give it reverence. We should give it respect. Remember what happened to Uzzah when he disrespected something that represents God. It was given, that disrespect passed on to God himself. So the like circumstance applies to the images as well. This is precisely why we give respect to them, why we venerate them. Either affirm that or deny that you can make images of Christ. Okay, that means you're going to have to completely go iconoclastic and deny making images of any human person, or just deny making images wholesale. You can't make any image at that stage. So all or nothing. This is an all or nothing situation. And you cannot deny that we are commanded to treat holy things with reverence. So when you look at all of these things, all of these points, it reaches to one conclusion, and that is that icon veneration is very clearly biblical. Thanks for watching, and I would like to give a special shout out to all the people who are financially supporting me and my channel. Thank you to Astrapai, Marco, Theodore, Vander, Robert, Sean, Larry, Andy, Gil Serum, Peyton, Gigachad, Sup, Michael, Sean, Tim, Brian, Marco, Diet Salt Light, Allison, Eddie, and Node, Maximus, Vlad, Kerry, Mike, Nectarius, and Norbert. Thank you all for supporting me, and thank you all for watching this. If this video has helped you, make sure to like and share it to your friends. Maybe this might be for their benefit as well. I will see you all in the next video or perhaps stream. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.